Thank you. I had records and I had CDs of Tony Bennett and cassettes. I still have cassettes of him. We were up in North Carolina when he passed away, so I quickly YouTubed his performance with Lady Gaga. If you haven't seen that, or the 60 Minutes, which Michael reminded me about how that was made in spite of his Alzheimer's and how it played out so beautifully. It's really inspiring. So I showed it to some of the grandchildren who, of course, they knew who Lady Gaga was. They had no idea who Tony Bennett was, but they appreciated the story and, of course, his extraordinary voice and persona. He was just an incredible persona. So every week, of course, we read the Torah over and over and over again, same book. And think about it. Would you read the same novel every year, right? A really good novel, you might maybe read it 2-3 times in a lifetime because it's really good. Same thing with a good show. Maybe you watch a series 2 times. At the Torah, read year after year after year because every time we find new wisdom in it. That's what amazes me the most about it, the new wisdom. And as we look at things that are happening in the world or just in our own life, the wisdom is so powerful and really so simple that sometimes we miss it. We just gloss over it. So there were 2 lessons, one from the calendar, which we're experiencing now, and one from the Torah reading tomorrow, which, by the way, you know that you read a portion of the Torah reading already, because the 2nd paragraph of the Shema is in tomorrow's Torah reading. So you already did it. There's more to it than that, but you did that paragraph. So we're in a period of time known as the 7 weeks of consolation. Now, a few weeks ago, were the 3 weeks of disaster, right, which culminated in the 9th day of Av, Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning, the only other 24-hour day fast, a day of sadness, a day in which we read a book which is really is a horrifying book, the Book of Lamentations, which describes the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem in very, very graphic, almost Holocaust-like language, very powerful book describing the disaster. And during that 3-week period, it was very quiet around here because there were no weddings. You know, there's a lot of weddings here. Pretty much no weddings anywhere in the Jewish world. Some count 9 days, some do 3 weeks, but in general, there's a period of time without weddings. And in the traditional world, there's no eating of meat for 9 days except on Shabbat, a period of intense mourning. Because after all, what happened? The first temple was destroyed. We lost our sovereignty. Then we returned 70 years later, and after a period of time, we rebuilt the second temple, restored our sovereignty after the Maccabean victory over the Greeks. And then it happened again. In the year 70, the Romans come, destroy the temple, destroy Jerusalem, the end of our sovereignty, exile, and it's 2,000 years of exile. So it is a period of tremendous disaster for Jewish history. Yet we realize the Jewish people are the only people in history, the only people on the face of the earth ever to suffer an exile for a long period of time, a destruction of their capital, a destruction of their sovereignty, and then returned and reestablished themselves in their homeland. Nobody has ever done that except for the Jewish people. So the question has to be asked, how is this possible? What was there in the tradition that made it possible? A very deep believer will say God made it possible. But leaving God out of it for this moment, what was it in the nature of the Jewish people that they remained loyal to God to make it even possible to reestablish our nation in our own homeland, revive, first time in history, a dead language, so now it's a modern spoken language of Hebrew, and restore the nation in its homeland? How was that possible? And the answer to that comes from the great wisdom of the rabbis who established the tradition called the 7 weeks of consolation. We're in them now. 3 weeks of disaster and mourning, but then 7 weeks of consolation. And each week we read in the synagogue a section from the prophets, the Haftorah, which is very positive looking. Jerusalem will be rebuilt. We will be restored. The relationship with God will be restored. The temple will be rebuilt. There'll be a renewal of the Jewish people, the most flowery, beautiful language of the prophet Isaiah. Every Haftorah, from the greatest of all the poets in the Bible, who is known as Isaiah. And it's 7 weeks, not 3 weeks. It's more than twice. 7 weeks of looking forward, 7 weeks of consolation, 7 weeks of believing that it can be done, that it can be rebuilt, that it can be restored. Overwhelms the 3 weeks. And in that 7 weeks, we just observed it this past week, you have a day called Tu B'Av, probably the most unknown day on the Jewish calendar. But if you look it up, it's almost like the Sadie Hawkins Day for the Jewish people. It's the 15th day of Av. 9th of Av, temple is destroyed. Less than 1 week later, Tu B'Av. What happens on Tu B'Av? They get married. Shidduchs are made, and people get married. In other words, it was purposeful. Less than 1 week after the 3 weeks of tragedy, it's time to get married. In other words, what is marriage a symbol of? It's simply a symbol of future, belief in the future, right? Building community, building family, building future. So the rabbi said, even though you have to remember the disasters, as great as they were, the loss of the temple, the sovereignty, complete destruction, you have to focus more on the nechemta, on the consolation, on the belief that it can be rebuilt, it can be reestablished. Now, we were in North Carolina for we have a summer trek to North Carolina, and we keep on increasing the number of grandchildren that come. So this year we had 9 grandchildren, along with our daughter and son-in-law. So 4 adults, 9 grandchildren from ages 11 to 18. That meant the Seder every night for dinner, right? So Tisha B'Av often happens while we're in North Carolina. So how do you observe the day? It's kind of awkward. So we decided to find, each year, we look for some type of documentary or movie, something that would be appropriate to match the day. And we discovered, we had heard about but hadn't watched, a series, I think it's 9 or 8 hour-long programs on the life of Meep Geese. Meep Geese was the one who risked her life, along with her husband, which we didn't know much about, but he turns out to be as great a risk-taker and hero as she was. We just didn't know about him. To try and save, to hide Anne Frank and her family, and a few others in their home, in their place of work. So it's her story. It's brilliantly done. You have to see it. It's absolutely genius. And the movie ends, of course, we know how it ends. The only survivor is Otto Frank. He comes back, and the story ends with hearing about his work to make sure the diary of his daughter was preserved. And so the grandkids were asked, because it ended, they said, what happened to Otto Frank? We know everyone else was killed. Everyone else was killed or died as a result of disease in the last few months of the Holocaust. And some of the kids are really curious. What happened to Otto Frank? You know, it's said when he died in his late 80s. But what it didn't tell us, and most of us didn't know unless we Googled it, Otto Frank actually remarried a number of years later to a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz, where he had survived. And they met each other again, married. He had no children left, of course, but she had a child. So he became a stepdad. And what they don't tell you about Meep Geese, who was absolutely determined not to have children because of her own childhood experience, she actually did have a child. Because she realized the only response to losing Anne and Anne's sister and the other young people who were there is she had to have a child. She had to bring something good into this world. And so what we see there is she understood, and Otto Frank understood the lesson of the 3 weeks and then the 7 weeks. The reason the Jewish people were able to reestablish themselves after 2,000 years of exile, maintain the Jewish people as a nation, all those years was because we understood that the response to disaster is Tu B'Av, is the 15th of Av, time to get married, go forward, rebuild, restructure, have hope. And that lesson is a lesson that Otto Frank understood, and that's a lesson that Meep Geese came to understand as well. So that simple lesson of it, even after disaster, 3 weeks of disaster, you have to have 7 weeks of consolation. By the way, what does it lead into? What's the 8th week? There isn't 8 weeks. The 8th week is Rosh Hashanah. I mean, the rabbi said, we go into the new year with 7 weeks of hope and celebration and comfort, and the 3 weeks is so far back in our memory that's there. You don't forget. And even at the wedding, you break a glass for 1 second. You moment, you stop, you pause, you remember the destruction, but then you celebrate. So that simple lesson that comes from this 3 weeks and the 7 weeks, 3 weeks of destruction and 7 weeks of consolation, is the secret to our survival. And it's the secret to survival of any person, any family, any nation, is to understand you can't remain in mourning indefinitely. And you have to believe in a future, and you have to work towards that future and build that future. That's what allowed the Jewish people to regroup after the Holocaust, and amazingly, to reestablish the state of Israel in less than 4 years after the Holocaust came to an end. An unprecedented event in human history, and it was because we had already absorbed that lesson. And the number of marriages, I mentioned Otto Frank marrying, but the number of marriages that took place in the DP camps, they didn't even wait to get resettled, right? They didn't wait. They said, no, we rebuild now. We don't know what our future is, but we're going to build that future, and we'll build it together. The number of weddings, I know rabbis who were rabbis in the army who told me about the number of weddings they did, Jewish weddings and DP camps, of people who had lost everything and said, it's time now to move forward, rebuild a family, rebuild our community. So that simple lesson that we learned from these two opposites, 3 weeks of destruction and 7 weeks of consolation, is a lesson for us as individuals. It's a lesson for our community. It's a lesson from every community that faces destruction. You know, we've all seen how over the years we've seen tornadoes, we've seen hurricanes, and we've seen entire towns blown away, literally, completely blown away, complete destruction. And then the greatest thing is when 2-3 years later, you see the special when the news, does something nice instead of covering only disaster, when they cover that story about how they rebuilt. And they talk about why they rebuilt and how they rebuilt. That is a lesson that comes from the history of the Jewish people. It has served us very, very well throughout our history, and it can serve anyone who learns that lesson from our history and from our Torah reading. Shabbat Shalom.